Well, Deacon Daniel Galadza, thank you so much for joining us on Zhyve TV for a short interview that I hope will be very informative and interesting to our audience.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Julian.
So the question we have for you today is, should Ukrainian Greek Catholics, Eastern Catholics in general, visit Orthodox churches?
I think the simple answer is yes, of course. Our own Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, if you want to use the term, identifies as an Orthodox church in communion with Rome. That kind of title isn't in any way official, but I think it summarizes our ecclesiology very well, and that's a term that I know that Father Andriy Chirovsky at the Sheptytsky Institute would use very often. It was not always well received by Orthodox, for example.
Because for Orthodox, for example, the definition of Orthodox that some use is by definition not being in communion with Rome, and therefore, since we are in communion with Rome, they're like, well, you can't be both.
Exactly, which
judgment.
Then, not to go too far off topic, but then one might ask, well, somebody like St. Theodore Studite or saints of the first millennium that sometimes were at conflict with the Patriarch of Constantinople or other Eastern patriarchs but appealed to Rome, does that mean they're not Orthodox? It gets complicated, right. And it's oftentimes good not to define oneself as what you're not. And I think Father John Baer mentioned that very often, that in the 20th century very often there would be...
He's an Orthodox theologian.
Yes, that's right. A professor at St. Vladimir Seminary now in Aberdeen, Scotland, noted how in the 20th century very often there would be Orthodox theologians that would try to define Orthodox theology in comparison with Roman Catholic theology in the West, and he preferred to, in the 21st century, to just define what it is that the Church believes, and very often it's something in common. Going back to the identity of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, in 1596, when our Church, the Kievan Metropolis, signed the Union of Brest with the Pope of Rome, with the Catholic Church, in the first years really nothing changed. So it was an Orthodox church that entered into communion with Rome, and that's kind of the calling of all Christians to unite, to restore this union that Christ calls us to. In the prayer in Gethsemane, he prays that all may be one, and in that respect, we're all supposed to be together without kind of losing our own identity, so to say.
So if we do visit churches as Eastern Catholics that we're not necessarily in communion with, what do we stand to learn?
Well, first of all, I should say that before the Second Vatican Council, that probably wouldn't have been so encouraged for Catholics, for Eastern Catholics, to visit Orthodox churches, although that would happen. But after the Second Vatican Council, there's been a call to all the Eastern Catholic churches to rediscover their ancestral traditions. There's the document from the Second Vatican Council, Orientalium Ecclesiarum, a document about the Eastern churches. In paragraph 6, it specifically talks about rediscovering our ancestral traditions, and many documents since that time, whether it's the Code of Canons of Eastern churches or an instruction on the application of those canons from 1996, says that we can learn our own traditions that have been lost in some cases by observing, by praying, by being together with our brothers and sister Orthodox Christians. So in a way, it's kind of rediscovering our own identity where it might have been lost in certain respects.
So it's been 400 years since our church entered in communion with Rome, and there have been other churches in Ukraine, based in Ukraine and elsewhere, Orthodox churches that we're not in communion with, that for the last 400 years have developed in one direction, and we have developed in a different direction. So when, for example, we visit Orthodox churches, or when we stand to learn, as the documents of the Second Vatican Council teach us to do from the Orthodox, what do we know is our tradition, or what do we know is something that was thought of somewhere else, or that is a little bit different from our own, that we could respect as being different, but might not necessarily be something that fits with the Ukrainian Catholic Church?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think it's something that our church is working kind of step by step to rediscover our own, whether it's general Byzantine Christian tradition or specifically the Kievan tradition that's been emphasized so much. And it's not something that's particularly new in the last few decades, even after the Second Vatican Council. Even before the Second Vatican Council, people like Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky or Patriarch Joseph Sleepy were promoting a return to our own traditions and fostering and encouraging research into these questions. So a lot of these questions are complex. And so when we go and visit other churches, Orthodox churches, for example, whether in Ukraine or if someone's in North America or Western Europe or Australia, they'll have an opportunity to visit churches that are perhaps not Ukrainian or not Slavic in any way, and so there will definitely be certain differences in the kind of outward manifestation of the liturgical rites.
The chant, for example, is something pretty different in like a Greek church
Exactly.
than in I don't know, a Ukrainian church or a Russian church or some sort of Slavic church.
Exactly. That's probably the first thing that you'll hear right away, a different way of singing, but the words that are being sung, whether the hymns or the ordinary or the propers of the various liturgical services, will probably 99% of the time be identical, perhaps with some minor textual variance. But also in terms of iconography, iconographic traditions, or even rubrics, the way the clergy move around in the church, or lay piety can be sometimes very different. And I think it's important to be aware that liturgical traditions do evolve sometimes. So even in Ukraine, the Kievan tradition that would have existed perhaps 600 or 700 years ago is not the same one that would have existed a few hundred years ago, or the one that the Kievan Metropolia lived by in 1596 when it signed the Union. So there would be influences from Greece or from the Middle East or from the West, or in some cases even from Muscovy. And so liturgy is something that's alive and develops over time without losing that core of our faith that is directed towards worship of Christ.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like there's a lot of, I guess you could say, stylistic differences. I think of, going to a wedding or a funeral or something like that, and outside of Ukraine, among my own friends, and they sing in Kievan chant, and they say, "Oh, that's Orthodox chant." Our Catholic chant is Galician chant, the chant of Western Ukraine. So, is that a misrepresentation of the differences between Catholic and Orthodox, and is there a way of kind of claiming that while also respecting the fact that we're not in communion, we want to be in communion, at least officially? How does that work at a local level on the basis of those stylistic quote-unquote differences?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think the example of music is a perfect kind of case study, because all these chants are regional, one could say. So you highlighted Galician chant or Kievan chant. In Ukraine, there's also Carpathian chant. And so these aren't in any way essential to differences to the expression of the faith. They're, like you say, stylistic. And so they're very often, with the example of these three chants, Kievan, Galician, and Carpathian chant, they often have the same roots. And if you would look at certain times of the liturgical year, hymns that are sung less frequently, the melodies would be almost identical. So going back to our experience of church life today, even my mother, when she came to visit Kiev a few years ago, she walked into one of our churches expecting to hear Kievan chant because she was in Kiev, and she heard Galician chant, and she thought, "Oh, that's interesting. I thought that they would sing Kievan chant in Kiev." And so the chants now sometimes are not connected with place. They're, like you say, connected more confessionally, if you want to call it that. And I think that's unfortunate, because there are many Orthodox who will sing Galician chant, which is now associated with our own Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which has its kind of heartland now in Galicia. But the richness of these various chants help the people to experience liturgical worship in a different way. For example, with the hymns of Vespers, that in the Galician chant tradition, we have certain particular melodies, but at the same time, there are many beautiful melodies from the Kievan tradition that sometimes we even sing in church, and people might not be aware that they're kind of mixing these different chant traditions together in the same service.
Now, it's very often the case, even though our church is very large and in a lot of different countries and cities and places, that you might visit a new place, and there isn't a Ukrainian Greek Catholic church there. There might not even be another Eastern Catholic church that one might visit. But almost as a rule, no matter where you are in the world, there are Roman Catholic churches and there are Orthodox churches. And, we talked a little bit earlier about the Second Vatican Council, where one can visit, but I'm always tempted when I'm visiting a new city to visit the Orthodox church, even though I'm not in communion with them, because it's the tradition that I know, that I grew up with, that I pray most readily in. Or I can go to a Roman Catholic church, which is a tradition that I'm very familiar with growing up in the United States, but it isn't my own. So how should people do that when they're traveling, when they're in a place that doesn't have their own particular church, in order to meet their obligations and also experience the liturgy that they were formed in?
That's an excellent question, Julian, and I wonder if there's something about a Chicago upbringing that makes people come to the same conclusion.
Chicago as well.
That's right, yeah. So, sweet home Chicago. I've had that dilemma many times as a layperson, and sometimes the solution has been to kind of go to the Orthodox Church for the Liturgy of the Hours, and then to the Roman Catholic Church for the Eucharist, for the Mass, or in our terminology, the Divine Liturgy, because unfortunately we're not in communion with the Orthodox churches right now. Even if an Orthodox priest would give communion to Eastern Catholics, which is technically permitted by the Catholic Church, if there's a need and the circumstances are such, that from the Orthodox side that won't always work. And so it's sometimes better not to anticipate this union that we're all praying for, the union of the churches, the union of all Christians. So I would say it seems kind of like a case-by-case basis, where sometimes even if you visit the same city many times, you'll maybe have friends in the Orthodox Church that you'll go visit, and at the same time, maybe that will encourage them to come when they come visit you, to visit your church. But I think it really depends on personal relationships, because that's what it's kind of all about. Yeah.
More seeking that union on the local level.
That's right.
So I have one last question for you, and that has to do with the experience that Eastern Catholics might have visiting Orthodox churches. I think some people might feel it's dishonest, right? That they have to admit that they're Eastern Catholic or something like that, or that they feel a little bit out of place, or sometimes if someone there knows that they're Eastern Catholic. There are the cases of some Orthodox churches, which I won't name, where they stand very strongly against Eastern Catholics, whereas others are relatively accommodating. So what should people say if an Orthodox person or a priest or someone comes up to them and says, "You don't belong here. This isn't your church. Why are you here? Are you infiltrating us? It's a very sensitive topic, I think, on both sides. And yet we do have so much to learn. So how should people handle that?
Well, that's can sometimes raise difficult difficult encounters if one comes to these Orthodox churches perhaps without the right state of mind. If our goal is to go there and to pray and to encounter Christ in the worship of these Orthodox communities, then I think God will take care of the rest. I'm not trying to just avoid a difficult situation, but without going into details, I've had many positive experiences where at the beginning I would come to these churches myself and thinking, will they throw me out? Like, you go to Mount Athos, you can hear all sorts of stories.
Which is a monastery complex in Greece.
A monastic peninsula that is kind of seen as one of the most strict places in the Orthodox Church throughout the world, and access is very difficult. You have to have special documents even granted by the church to enter for everybody. So Catholics are, there's a quota of how many Catholics are allowed, and some monasteries might not let
they check your papers or something?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So they might say that at this monastery, non-Orthodox are not allowed into the church, or they're not allowed into the refectory at the same time as other people. And I think that would be one extreme. In most cases, I think if someone does want to go and visit an Orthodox church, the community will actually be quite welcoming. And so I think if one goes with the right mindset, of course, you can have a negative experience, but I think things are such in the world today that the community that you are approaching will hopefully have an open heart to receive you if you come with an open heart as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So perhaps just before we end, I would like to highlight some books that I brought today that talk about this difficulty, the encounter between East and West, and particularly our own Orthodox tradition. Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, whom I mentioned before, was the head of the church in the first half of the 20th century, and was really kind of a forerunner of a lot of the positive developments in rediscovering our Eastern traditions since the Second Vatican Council. There's a biography of him by Father Cyril Korolevsky, translated in English. The original is in French.
People can find it on Eastern Christian Books.
There you go. I didn't even know that. So, or a Google search. Very interesting biography that also the person of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky covers all of Ukrainian Greek Catholic history in the first half of the 20th century. And his successor, the confessor of the faith, Patriarch Joseph Sleepy, was also a cardinal of the Catholic Church. A biography written by one of the foremost theologians of the 20th century, Yaroslav Pelikan, also talks about this difficulty of navigating an identity that is between East and West. He calls Patriarch Joseph Eastern Thomist. He was a very big fan of St. Thomas Aquinas, but at the same time would emphasize our Eastern tradition. And an analysis, kind of maybe a book that maybe a bit myth-busting, that by Father Peter Galadza on the theological and liturgical work of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky. Very often people say that, oh, Metropolitan Andrei, you know, he wears a white klobuk, he was super...
It's the hat.
Yeah, the white hat, that's super Eastern, kind of Orthodox mindset, but it analyzes a lot of his sources, that he was also highly influenced by St. Thomas Aquinas. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean he has a fully Latin theology. He was trying to navigate and find the path forward for our church in the 20th century. So
wonderful.
Further reading.
Great books. Should start a Zhyve TV book club.
That's right.
It'd be wonderful. I hope people find them. They're readily available online. Thanks so much, Deacon Daniel Galadza, for joining us on Zhyve TV today.
Thank you, Julian.
All right.